Hi everyone, my name is Tom Angel. I did my second report here on the book Slavery and African Ethnicities in the Americas by Gwendolyn Midlow Hall. Now, Gwendolyn Hall, she is a renowned historian born in New Orleans. She participated in many of the civil rights marches in the South. She was arrested for participating in a sit-in. She's someone who fought for equal treatment for African Americans. Having this background going into my book really helped me understand that uncovering different slave ethnicities wasn't just something she was tasked with doing. It was a culmination of a lot of her life's work and a lot of her life's passion. She looked at this not only as just a historical project, but also a moral project and a project to increase equality and really bring to light a lot of forgotten history. She taught at Elizabeth City State College and Rutgers, and her research and her life's work, it led to the creation of the 107,000 name Afro-Louisiana history and genealogy database. So there's 107,000 names from about a 50-year period of Louisiana history of forgotten slaves. I actually got the opportunity to visit this prior to learning about Hall as a historian in terms of this class's context. I went down to New Orleans and went to the Whitney plantation and actually visited this monument. And these are the names of some of the slaves that she found in her research. This research took her about 15 years to complete. She had about five different research assistants who were assisting her as well. And it was just an absolute passion project, and even calling it that's under an understatement. It was incredible the amount of immense research that went into it to really bring to light a lot of this forgotten history. She died in 2022 at the age of 93, and her work is extremely influential in terms of the field of history. It revolutionized the way historians write about slavery. A lot of her book is actually critiquing past historians and the way they've written about slavery. And the book itself, the first three chapters really do a great job of laying the foundation. They provide kind of the roadmap for the historical argument she's going to make. And whereas the last four chapters, they use these arguments in conjunction with specific geographic areas within Africa to really tie that connection together. And we look back here, it's called Restoring the Links as the subtitle. She's really trying to restore the links of what were the ethnicities in Africa that came over to America that were long forgotten, right? And trying to really break apart and break down some of the generalizations and misunderstandings that historians have kind of created throughout the last 100 years. Our preface, she does a really great job in the preface of outlining the goals for the book. She outlines that the goal of this work, she outlines it very, very clearly, and how she sought to make Africans more visible. She explains what historical steps she needed to take were. A big part of the introduction, like I mentioned earlier, critiques past historians and their methodology, and how she's saying that they're making generalizations. They're not looking at history in a multifaceted way like she does. She poses a challenge to the belief that African culture was fragmented, and she also does a really great job of highlighting that Africa is more than just this dark continent as it was historically perceived for so long. In her goal overall, she's mostly successful in achieving these goals. Her book really does highlight the various ethnicities that ended up coming over in the slave trade. But where she does struggle and where I struggled with this book um, was readability and oftentimes being repetitive. I felt as though some of the chapters could have been shorter and taken her argument and streamlined it, which would have made it one more readable, but also two, it would have made her argument a little bit stronger. She tends to bring up previous points that she makes multiple times in non-successive orders, like, oh, but hearing that point again, even though I heard it 10 pages ago, which is fine, right? She's emphasizing, but it could have been a little bit more streamlined to to increase the strength of her argument. Her argument's dull, not dull in a boring sense, but dull in terms of making less sharp. with her repetition and some of the heavy focus on data. I felt as though the data was both a gift and a curse because the data was really strong at some points and really strengthened her argument, and then sometimes it felt as though it didn't add to her argument, or it was just like, what do I do with this data? Not the right context or enough context given. But overall, an incredible read with a lot of really rich history and historiography included within it. I mean, the methodology that she uses is I find really hard to critique that. It's just more the readability that I would find would be my critiques of this book. So I'm going to take you through chapter by chapter and kind of outline where she's going with her work and what she did as she's reading or as I'm reading through it. I included an image and a quote from each chapter just to kind of illuminate what she was talking about. So the first chapter is called Gold, God, Race, and Slaves. What I found really interesting about this chapter is that she makes it a point to highlight a lot of the origins of slavery. And I found this was one of the most interesting chapters in the book, how slavery originated from the word Slav, how before Atlantic slave trade, racism was more directed towards Northern Europe. And the quote here says, for Atlantic slave trade, racism justifying slavery in medieval Spain and Portugal was aimed at people with light skin. So kind of taking our idea of slavery being this racism towards Africans and flipping that on its head. It talked about the and pardon me if I mispronounce it, the Almoravids from Africa and how they helped conquer Iberia and what their African reign was like, and really dispelling this notion that there were that the nations in Africa pre-slave trade were these like poor, impoverished places. They're actually quite rich with 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 different um, levels of wealth, and there was complex trading that went on that, and also that how that influenced the Iberian Peninsula with Portugal and Spain. I also found it interesting that the Pope justified slavery as an extension of reconquest, and that at first, when the slave trade first starts, it's Christianity that was dominating the discussions. It wasn't race. Slavery wasn't seen as a racial thing, it was seen as a religious thing. Like, we're going to bring religion, and slavery is just kind of an extension of that. She goes on to later say that Britain's Industrial Revolution was financed later in the later centuries from this Atlantic slave trade. And that's what eventually, in a trickle-down way, created wealth. So that was the first chapter. I included this map here of the Almoravid dynasty, um, showing where the Almoravid and the old Ghana Empire is, in relation, especially as well to Portugal and the Christian kingdoms of Spain, or what later becomes Spain. So chapter two talks about making invisible Africans visible, coast sports, regions, and ethnicities. So her thesis comes even more to light here in this chapter. She talks about the challenge is that the study tends to be generalized, that anthropologists fall into this trap. She highlights many of the flawed methodologies that previous historians have taken, and she critiques them very bluntly, but also respectfully, saying that one of the honors of her work is getting to critique scholars that she's studied and that she has the most esteem and respect for. She traces the history and challenges of the study of the African diaspora, and she defends her approach. And she really uses her transatlantic slave trade database, which is the basis for the monument I showed on the first slide, as um, her like where she's starting her argument from. She defines a lot of terms, which is really helpful throughout the rest of the book. The Windward Coast, Ivory Coast, Gold Coast. She mentions the Crew Mariners, who are an ethnic group who helped the British combat illegal slave trade. By bringing them up, she highlights that there's um, it's not all African ethnicities were just victims in this. There are also aggressors in terms of people who are going to defend the African continent from slave traders, and the crew are a good example of that. Um, really just making it more complex than just aggressor, colonizers, victim, African slaves, right? It's a more complex situation than that. She does describe that within the colonial powers, there's differentiation in terms of who had the best, most accurate, and most descriptive documents, comparing the French, who were had kept some of the best records and were most descriptive and accurate, whereas the English not so much. And a lot of the English documents were stored in private residences, and by private residents um, rather than being governmental documents. The big question that this chapter poses and brings up is which Africans. And what I mean by that is when they say, oh, we got African slaves, right? That's a very much a generalized statement that needs context, like which Africans. And as in the records that she looked at of the 8,900 records, there were 217 different ethnicities. So to make a large argument shorter, there's a lot of complexity when dealing with the African transatlantic slave trade, and she's really asking this question, which Africans, to show that it's a very complex issue that they're going for with. That it's not something that it's just the Africans, right? You got to make the distinction. And that she's critiquing other historians who collapse time, as she puts it. And in her study of ethnicities, it was African ethnicities, it's widely neglected. The quote here says no single pattern of creolization in Africa or the Americas. The pattern in which they kind of adapted to their new society wasn't just one pattern. It was a diverse way they assimilated or brought their culture with them wherever they went. So I think that's a big point that she's trying to make. Our third chapter, our third chapter talks about the clustering of African ethnicities in the Americas. Now, this whole idea of clustering is this idea that a large percentage of one ethnicity goes from one port to another port very quickly, or as quickly as trade would allow at that time. And the reason being is that many of the slave captains felt as though when when they were bringing their cargo, they didn't want spoilage, right? So what that meant is whenever slaves would die on this horrific voyage, packed in tightly in horrible conditions on these slave ships, that ultimately meant less money for people who sold slaves. So they wanted to just go from one place to another, maybe with a quick stop to refit or make repairs, but they weren't collecting slaves all up and down the coast in different areas in different ports and then dropping them off in different locations. They wanted to streamline it. So what that meant is there would be communities of certain ethnicities of Africans from going from one port in Africa to another port in the New World. Um, by 1590, Brazil became the world's leading sugar producer and was the greatest consumer of slaves in the West. One of her big critiques that she repeats often is that we focus so heavily on the English slave trade and that it was slaves in the colonies, this very American-centric view of slavery. But in reality, Brazil had the most slaves of anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And that fact she continues to bring up and repeat quite often. Um, Contrary kind of what we were saying earlier, contrary to myth, masters, they wanted their slaves to know a common language. So this whole idea of clustering, they didn't want this whole idea of like a Tower of Babel where all the slaves that no one knew each other's language because they weren't going to be as productive, right? The idea was if you took a group of slaves from one area in Africa and you brought them all to the same area in the New World, they could continue their customs, they could continue their culture, and they could communicate more effectively than if you completely took random slaves from random parts of Africa and they didn't have those common links. The argument at the end that there was a cluster of new Africans from the same ethnicity and region with gradual introductions of new regions. So it wasn't going to be all of a sudden whole new group of people. It was going to be a gradual mixing of regions. This is an image here of the wooden collars that were used in the slave trade. This is in the earlier slave trade. And the quote here there were predominant countervailing patterns that tended to cluster new Africans from same ethnicities and regions. So these were the first three chapters that really outline the historical argument she's going to be making throughout. The next four really look at these specific regions and try to apply these arguments and make the link between the New World and the West and African regions themselves. So chapter 4, let me get over to my next slide here. Chapter 4 talks about the area of Greater Senegambia and Upper Guinea. I'll start with the quote on this one, and we can see the map as well of this region. Guineans are the blacks who are most esteemed by the Spanish. And I want to just offer a quick apology if I'm getting any of the pronunciations wrong. For these, it's certainly not meant with any, disrespect or whatever. But so regardless, we've got our greater Senegambia and Upper Guinea. The last four chapters, like I said, linking the African regions with ethnicities within the United States and Latin America. Now, this region is defined as a region between the Senegal and the Sierra Leone rivers, and Hall's argument is against minimizing contributions of slaves from this area. So we can see the rivers that she's talking about here. The last half of the 16th century was the Guinea phase of the Brazil slave trade, and then she talks a lot about what other goods were traded because that was a big part of this. Things like salt, cotton, rum, sugar all get some airtime in this chapter as really relevant to the slave trade. She uses Phyllis Wheatley as a great example of a famous American who is from Gambia, and considered herself a Mandingo. She makes the argument the United States was the most important place where Senegambians clustered, and strong anecdotes at the end of this chapter existed. Now, the strong anecdotes at the end I want to talk a little bit about because she talks a lot about the kind of like underground slave culture and society in New Orleans. This guy, Foy, he was a big part of that. And to the naked eye, it was not very rich. But when you look beneath the surface, they had their own cultural music and dances and traditional foods, and they kept different traditions. And a lot of the people from this region who were slaves in New Orleans and lower Louisiana really kept the culture alive in many ways. So she used a good anecdote to talk about that in this chapter and really bring that to light. Another part of this chapter was when she refers to Landinos as Latinized Africans, as she refers to them as Landinos, or Ladinos. She talked about how the meaning of Guinea changed over time, and part of the problem with the historians is that they've just taken this idea of Upper Guinea, right? And it's meant different things to different historians, and rather than taking the time to give a full and accurate definition of where Guinea is, what Guinea is, define the complexities and differentiate parts of Upper Guinea, it was just kind of a broad thing. And so she uses this chapter to make it a more specific title as well. So chapter 5 talks a little bit about Lower Guinea, the Ivory Coast, Gold Coast, Slave Coast, and Bight of Benin. So the differentiation she uses is she talks about how the different coasts really tell you who is or what's being traded from that coast. The Kwa language groups were linked with Lower Guinea, as it says, and that the differentiation, like we said, lies with these different products. Now, what I thought was really interesting about this chapter was just the European power that existed on the African continent, that there were 32 European fortresses built along the Gold Coast, just the Gold Coast. And it shows that not only was there heavy European involvement, but there was also heavy colonial investment being made, right? The European colonial powers were very invested in protecting these resources, both going in and going out, that they would build this many fortresses. She does a really good job in this chapter as well of highlighting which European power had supremacy during the 1600s, starting with the Dutch, then the English, then the French. We get introduced to a gentleman by the name of Alonso de Sandoval. He was a Jesuit missionary in the 1600s. And in 1627 he writes about how he writes about the Minna. Now the Minna were really interesting and something that I really struggled to wrap my head around. They were a group of people, but their interpretation is up. It's up to has various meanings and it's up for interpretation. I'm more or less struggled with it because she kind of starts to give a really solid foundation for who the Minna were and where they were located. Then by the end of the chapter, she's like, well, it's also up for interpretation, and that's part of the historical problem that we have to be faced with. So it was a little bit somewhat confusing to me. I don't know if that was whether it was just not reading it closely enough, or like user error, or she could have clarified more, or a little bit of both. But she does highlight this guy who was a Jesuit missionary who, for religious purposes, was trying to define the ethnicities in the area and did a good job to define the Minna in that time period. She goes into detail about um, she asked the question, who were the Minna, and how the Louisiana and Cuba spoke a common language, right? And that a lot of times the answer to this question is also dependent on the language of the document you're reading. So if you're reading a Dutch document, the Minna might be one group of people. If you're reading a French document, they might be another group of people. And that's one of the strengths of her methodology is that she's trilingual. She speaks English, Spanish, and French, which really is a major factor for her in terms of why she's so successful putting this work together. She's able to see the English define the Minna as a group of people from this place, whereas the French define them as a group of people from here. And I think that's kind of what she's getting at. The more I explain it, the more I'm kind of wrapping my head around this complex issue. But she does do a really good job of using Sandoval as someone who, whether meaning to or not, did the work of a historian, even if he had religious motivations. Talks about Edo being a major ethnicity in the Bight of Benin, and very few Edo appeared in American documents. So not a big factor, not a big ethnic group within the American slave world. And then it talks here, Minna normally was either an ethnic or a coastal designation, although it included the Gold Coast, was often specific ethnicity ported from the slave coast. So lots of different meanings for one word. That's kind of the best way to put it. We're on to chapter 6. Got a couple more to go here. Now, chapter 6 talks about Lower Guinea, the Bight of Biafra. Biafra, I think that's how you pronounce it. So the Bight of Biafra was separate from the Ivory, Gold, and Slave Coast. There was some islands off of the coast that this was where a lot of these people who a lot of these people from Lower Guinea were from. It's in the current modern day southeastern Nigeria, and there's an ancient Igbo population that occupy the Niger Delta about 5,000 years ago. Now, what I find really interesting about the Igbos is that this is one of the most overlooked ethnic groups that she talks about. And I think this was one of the chapters where I think her methodology really comes to light, and she's really successful with this chapter talking about the Igbos. It was interesting because they had less Muslim influence upon them than their neighbors. A lot of their neighbors had a lot of Muslim influence, so they had more traditional African influences and less Muslim influences. Now, the Igbo culture, it's a debated question on how influential their culture was in the slave trade, because some people referred to them as refused slaves and they were not thought of as highly desirable, um, and that they didn't intermarry just amongst each other. They married due to the high percentage of women. Um, they were not marrying within, they're marrying without, which led to somewhat of a diffusion of culture. They were the least endogamous, and this led to a slight diffusion. And there were no distinct enclaves. So then what that means is we're the the argument used to be that they were less popular, or I guess rather less influential, so to speak, and there was this idea of imperfect representation. But where that argument gets fishy is it contrasts with the fact that during the Spanish period of colonial control of Louisiana, the Igbo slaves were actually more expensive, and they were higher in price. They were looked at, especially the women, as really desirable due to their high reproductive rates. And they were not as isolated as many historians claim. So she goes through her methodology to really critique a lot of the previously held beliefs that the Igbo were refused slaves. They had no distinct culture, that they were isolated. And she goes through a lot of these documents, both in Africa and in the United States of different languages to really uh to throw and cast doubt on that argument. I thought that it was interesting as well that she talks about some of the other recorded ethnicities, the Abibo, the Moko, the Ikoi, the Asan, the Bioko, and the Calabar, and mentioning how they were clustered in the Caribbean and the Chesapeake. And even though they were a smaller representation and smaller numbers in population, bringing up these other ethnicities, I felt like was a good point that she made, and added more context. The last chapter, chapter 7, talks about West Central Africa and Mozambique. It's estimated 40 to 45% of all enslaved Africans brought to the Americas originally came from West Central Africa, and they spoke Bantu. Now, this chapter really outlined the plight of the Congolese and the people who used to live in the Congo, and there was immense suffering after the interactions of the Portuguese. Now, the culminating battle was in 1665 with the Battle of Mwambila. Now, what was interesting about that is it talked about the rich in prosperous, extensive trading networks that the Congo had, and then the Portuguese come in and absolutely decimate them with slavery, with the slave trade, and the people of the Congo are not able to recover from that. Traders then swarmed to Mozambique, even once trading was that should say outlawed. So once it was outlawed, they swarmed to Mozambique. And then in these areas, slave trading both began and ended late. So even after the slave trade ended, there were still slave traders going to Mozambique, and it was seen as a place where they could still get away with slave trading, even though it was outlawed because it was, not very well enforced in a lot of places. 1730s, our quote, 1730s, majority of documented transatlantic slave trade voyages to South Carolina arrived from West Central Africa. Our last chapter here is just, or the conclusion. I thought this was a really great quote that she says at the end about African cultures. They're neither preserved nor pickled. They should not be treated as static or viewed in isolation from each other in Africa or the Americas. Specific African regional cultures and ethnicities should no longer be invisible. That's essentially her goal. This is how she ends the book. I just put this in here as a way to show this is the last thing she writes that really um shows her argument in the fullest. She highlights the importance of avoiding broad generalizations or romanticizing history. Her conclusion is very well rounded. It really brings to light everything she talks about. It repeats calls for analyzing a wider array of sources, and she really argues that this book is just the beginning, right? That her work shouldn't be the end all be all, but it's just the beginning. She examines, as we mentioned, both slave journey data and descriptions of African ethnicities to determine where the clustering occurred, and it created a very accurate answer to a complex question. So that's the gist of it. I think overall it was a very insightful book and really revealed a lot about something that I'm definitely didn't have a lot of background knowledge in. With that being the case, I thought there were times that she could have condensed and made it a little bit more readable, more narrative. I thought her strengths were when she used those anecdotes and less when she used the data. Obviously, the data was both a gift and a curse in some ways, but overall, a very insightful book. And I was really glad that I got the opportunity to read it and bring you this presentation. Thank you so much.